Greetings and welcome back. This is the retrospective of the Intel i3 6100 PC build, also known as Lola or Chihuahua. This was our first build that we did in this series, and this was intended for a lower end box, kind of intentionally wanting to play with this chip, but for software development, Xcode builds in a Hackintosh scenario, and Ubuntu for doing just general node development and that kind of stuff. So this was not intended to be a gaming system or anything very, very high end, and we're going to go through it. So the idea here was it was intended to be responsive, so I wanted some good single core performance as well as some dual core. So the i3 actually works really well here because we have hyperthreading, so it actually gives you the 4 threads along with the 2. Now this machine, again, working on Xcode builds and a couple things like that, these things are single core heavy. Xcode builds, especially when you're doing the iOS simulator and a whole bunch of other things on here, they actually run in a single thread. So because of this, the single thread performance was really important. So not going with, say, an i5 or anything like this, which I didn't want to do. I wanted this to be just a build box, so I didn't want to go with a high-end build. The specifications we have here, we have the Intel Skylake i3 6100, really good performer. It has a 3.7 gigahertz single core. It runs pretty well. Again, this is the lower end of the Skylake series, but a really good performance to value. 16 gigabytes of Corsair Vengeance LPX memory, standard DDR4, 2133 megahertz. Really good quality. A lot more memory than I really could have needed for this box, but it was a good choice. Gigabyte Z170 HD3 motherboard. This is the lower end of the 170s, and actually still quite a good board. This is actually in the ultra durable series, so it's pretty good. Noctua NH-L9i cooler. It's a low profile cooler, so it's good in smaller cases, and actually works really well in this as well. The EVGA 500 watt 80 plus. A lot more headroom in this one. It's a good quality, I guess a middle of the range EVGA power supply. Really impressed with it. Crucial BX200 480 gigabyte serial ATA solid state disk. Again, kind of a low end, but actually the performance turned out to be pretty good. Western Digital 640 gigabyte black 7200 RPM HD. This is for time machine backups, any of that kind of stuff. So it actually was even more performance than even necessary for that purpose. We used a T-Link N900 PCIe Wi-Fi. This particular adapter is a Hackintosh friendly card, so that's one of the reasons for choosing that. Same thing with the IOGear USB Bluetooth, same situation, really good for using a trackpad or anything along those lines. And then we come to the AeroCool GTRS black case. Now this case is beautiful, and I do like some of the lighting that's in it, but it is really cumbersome, and ultimately we ended up replacing it. Unfortunately, we chose another AeroCool, and subsequently the case itself was also hard to get in. So would I recommend this case? I'm not so sure. Maybe not. If you were just putting a board in here where you weren't expecting to have a lot of cable management, maybe so, but I wouldn't say that it's all that great. We also installed Ubuntu 16.10. It's been upgraded to 17.04 now. However, at the time I was using the 4.10 kernel along with this. And because at this time I also didn't have a GPU, I was using the Intel GPU, the iGPU. I installed the open source drivers for Intel, which the performance was actually quite good. It performed really well. Standard working through the OS. And you just kind of using some of the effects, the compositor and everything, along with standard coming out of Unity, ran extremely well. Mac OS, it's glitchy, it's not that great. It did work fairly well. However, knowing this was temporary, it wasn't a concern. So, going through the theming and some neat stuff with the Ubuntu desktop, it actually looks quite nice. And this was kind of the experience we went with. Now, benchmarks were interesting. So just doing some standard Geekbench, I was actually quite surprised that this performed as well as it did, although I really shouldn't have been, considering Skylake is a good performer, and even though this is a low-end CPU, it's actually a really good performer. Look at the single core is pretty decent, and multi-core worked out really well as well. It's scaled nicely. It sits pretty much exactly half of what you'd see with an i7. Again, not too surprising there, but it's literally sliced that thing in half. If you have something around the 3.7 or 3.8 range, the single core is pretty close. So if you take that apart and take a look at it in comparison to some of my other machines, Blackintosh is a 6700K overclocked to 4.5 gigahertz. And as you can see, the single core performance is pretty close. And again, not too surprising there, considering Skylake is a good performer. And look at the multi-core performance. It's really much double, which is what you'd expect. Geekbench sometimes is a little off, but that's really good. And considering, putting in perspective, my Mac Pro, which is a dual Xeon 5690, it has a 3.46, I guess exact gigahertz Xeon processor. There's 12 cores in that. The single core performance on those Xeons are not that great. So if you look at it, the fact that it's just barely slower single core wise to the i3, again, that shows that there's been some advancements with Skylake, obviously in single core. So if it can beat out something of just a little bit slower clock speed, and obviously multi-core makes a big difference there. As you can see, the multi-core is quite high. Now, also putting in perspective, this was intended to replace a MacBook Core 2 Duo. So you could see 2 cores to another 2 cores. Huge improvement, absolutely huge improvement. Single core was just horrible on that box, and dual core didn't really help much. So this was a major improvement. So that pretty much wraps it up for Lola. Lola was a really, really surprising and enjoyable machine to use. And essentially, after some upgrades, we did in fact install a GPU. In fact, it was a GTX 1080 Ti. I'm sorry, 1050 Ti, not 1080 Ti. Ooh, we didn't need that. But it actually really, really, really worked out well. And we decided that it would work out as a nice little build box and continue to use it. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next one, and we'll see you in the next build series. This was the first of it, and until then, folks, until then.